really big deal, right? You're making a contract, a pact that you have to honor. And we go to the ends of the earth to honor. Like journalists will go to jail to honor this contract, and it's incredibly important, and we take it very seriously here at the school. So for that reason, don't go off the record, right? Until we've basically spoken with you and kind of walked through what that means. And you have to explain to your source what that means. And generally what off the record means is that means you're not going to use any portion of that in your story. On background is a whole different statement, and we have to explain and teach sources what that means. On background means that you might, and maybe Robert can talk a little bit, because maybe he's been on background or spoken on background at various times, and what that means basically means like they're going to source but not by name. They're going to say someone within the city, or, according to someone in the city who wanted to not have their name used or something like that. And so that's on background, right? And that's basically, yes.
So I was in a situation in my last internship where someone agreed to speak with me on background, and subsequently he seems to have understood it as off the record. Like, what do you do in that situation?
That happens all the time. So that's why you have to clarify, because on background or not for attribution, you have to be very clear. Like, here's how I'm going to use this. I'm going to say someone from this thing. They're like, no, don't say from the police department. That's too. They'll figure it out. Can you just say someone from the city? Okay. And so we have that conversation to be hyper clear that people know. And if you break that contract, if you end up using their name, if you say something, you attribute something, that erodes your credibility entirely. Now, because we want this to be a candid conversation, because we want Robert to tell us really what's kind of going on behind the scenes, this conversation will be off the record, for the most part, and then at a certain point, if it's relevant to some of your stories, and we want to just ask some questions on the record, like, hey, I could really, that thing you told, could I cite you or do a follow-up story, and we'll have that conversation at the end of this talk, if that makes sense. So this is just not on background, but just background information, just for us to understand a little bit about Richmond. And it's just better because, Robert works in an environment where the things he says come back to him and get reflected on his work, on his job. And so in order for him to tell us some of the things about Richmond and about his job, I don't want him to have to just dance around every little sentence he says. Does that make sense? Okay, great, thank you.
That's perfect, Jeremy, and I'll just add to that. You can have me anytime you want me. Just call, and we'll talk, and we'll do what we can. Right now, I'm thinking more of a frank discussion for educational purposes. So, at the risk of Jeremy's admonishment earlier, on my first trip to Richmond 12 years ago, I wound up diving to the concrete to take cover from automatic gunfire from a passing car.
It's rare situation.
Yeah. Freak occurrence, 2009. Today, after that inauspicious beginning, I live in Richmond, I raise a family in Richmond, I serve the public in Richmond, and I love it, it's my home. But on that day, we had gone out to a restaurant on 23rd Street, since closed, I believe, called Pepito's on 23rd. And we were doing just a story with multimedia tools in boot camp. It was more about the process than the story itself. And we happened to come under fire. Not directed at us, but there was a passing vehicle and something had gone on. There'll be more to this story, I'll come back to it. That same year in 2009 was a particularly violent and terrible year in Richmond. The final homicide total that year was 45. In a city of 100,000 people, that's very significant. That's what puts it up in the most dangerous cities in the state or in the country lists. That kind of per capita rate of violent crime, in this case homicides. Those numbers rivaled the all-time historic highs that Richmond saw in the early 90s. Richmond is an incredible city, an incredible place to be performing your reporting duties, to be learning about journalism, because in many ways Richmond is a microcosm of many parts of the whole country. A place where there's change afoot, where the legacy of post-industrialization is still apparent, where demographic change is occurring at a rapid pace. Change throughout Richmond. And whenever there's change, There are benefits and there's costs. There are winners and there are losers during particular intervals of time. And you can see all of that occurring in Richmond. Now, since 2009, in terms of crime and violent crime, Richmond has been a national success story. A place where a city's police department that had terrible relations with the community, and in fact was the subject of an early 1980s 60 Minutes piece that was done by our own Lowell Bergman that you can still find about racial discrimination in the police department and violence and systemic violence. I mean, essentially Ferguson, or you name any other city that has similar problems, because Ferguson's obviously not alone. And Richmond was that, at least in terms of the media spotlight, as early as 1982 or 1983. So a lot has happened in the last 12 years, and Richmond is a tremendous amount different than it was. But things like conflict and triumph and heartbreak, all the things of which great stories are made, regardless of what mediums or what tools you're using, they're all still there. So when I'm at the restaurant and the gunfire erupts, I'm with a partner. That's who I was with to do the filming. We were asking a patron about what he thought about Pepito's burritos. And this discussion was unfortunately unceremoniously interrupted. And when we got up, we already heard the screeching tires, the screams, the smell of the burnt rubber, and the gunpowder was already wafting in the air. And the adrenaline sort of took over. And we ran out there against our better judgment, and we started gathering interviews. And we started looking for the shell casings, taking pictures. And then we brought that back. And that was the kickoff for that 2009 inaugural website. And you can see all those stories now because it's beautifully archived to this day. In 2009, the stories that were dominating our consciousness and our website as we were launching this whole project was crime. And Chevron loomed over everything. And the economy and poverty played a big role. In 2009, we're talking about the leading edge of the housing bust, or no, actually the last part of the housing bust. So we're thinking about economy, poverty, pollution, post-industrialization, crime. These were the big stories that we were following at the time. And in the end, what did we learn through that whole process? We learned that drama and conflict and looking at the kinds of things that traditional media often does when they're looking at cities like this, when they parachute in, that works sometimes to some degree in terms of clicks, in terms of eyeballs, in terms of getting people interested in the site. But there's a cost to that approach as well. And you have a lot of negative reaction also. And when I look back over those first few years, what I see is the stories that did the best, they weren't the stories of a particularly egregious instance of street crime or a story of Chevron's externalities in the community, or even of the poverty that was so prevalent at that time. The stories that did the best, that had the most engagement, the most positive feedbacks, based on the analytics we were using at that time, were still those human stories. Those stories about people. They still contain things like triumph and heartbreak and conflict and drama. But they were often about people in the community. There's an authenticity to it. There was a difference. There was a greater level of care and engagement than people were used to from the traditional media that was covering the area at the time. Now that landscape has changed somewhat since then. Maybe somewhat is an understatement. There are far fewer traditional media. There's fewer resources for them to be covering. So we talked about a news desert in 2009, and by those traditional metrics, they're greater now. But there's also greater opportunity. more people are on socials all day long, more people are engaged on different platforms. Traditional media has missed the boat quite often in terms of being able to engage this audience, but the audience is still there. They're just hungry for content in different ways. And part of the exciting thing that you do with this work is you have ample opportunity to experiment, to engage in those ways, those different platforms, different ways of storytelling, and what it is that ultimately resonates with your audience. Building trust with the audience takes a long time. And building trust with the audience is really easy to lose. It takes forever to build, and it goes down in a moment. And in news, just like in any business, although we're always often loath to compare ourselves to any other business, trust and relationships and authenticity deeply matter. And that's especially apparent when you're doing deep work in a community rather than just parachuting in and out overnight. You'll notice that much more apparent. It's much more genuine. It's much more lasting. The relationships you make here, who knows where they'll ultimately lead. For me, I wasn't from the area. I never left. I'm not saying that any of you or all of you will have the same concern or the same scenarios that I will, but it's to say that you'll never know. And the work that you're doing now, think about it as though it matters, because it certainly does. So let's talk about today. I told you, I already kind of hooked you a little bit with the story, the anecdote from the very beginning. But let's talk about what's going on now, because the Richmond of today is much different than the Richmond of 2009. Crime is not the number one story that everybody's talking about. What are the big stories? There is some overlap, but some of them we simply wouldn't have, they weren't on our radar in 2009. A big one. Climate change. It's huge. Sea level rise. You may not know that Richmond has the most shoreline of any city in the Bay Area. In fact, by a wide margin. And much of it is marshy. Much of it is vulnerable to small increases or decreases, increases in sea level and in temperature. I'm part of various committees where we're looking at exactly this thing. We're looking at building levees in areas of the East Bay that are supposed to be resistant to several feet of sea level rise over the next century. And some of the more conservative projections have it at just that. Some have it as much as 10 feet. Though, if that were to happen, then maybe the way we're planning for now might not be sufficient. Chevron. It was a big issue then, it's a big issue now. And it's changed a little bit since then. The Chevron of 2009 was about heavy pollution, industrial legacy, insensitivity to community needs, and also overbearing, weighing in, spending basically into local politics. Richmond was a company town, and Chevron paid to keep it that way. That's not the case anymore. I'll talk a little bit about how that happened. But now Chevron has done a major modernization of their plant. It is cleaner by any metric. However, now there's the flaring that occurs. Now, the flaring, it's important to see this in context. What happens is when a refining unit gets to too high a temperature, they have to let off steam, basically, to prevent an explosion or a catastrophic event, as they call it. And in doing that, that emits a very visible flame and the smoke that comes with that, and it's visible throughout the Bay Area. Now, this kind of thing happened all the time in the 60s and 70s. There was no flaring. The valves were just wide open. You go to the Gulf Coast today, you can see a little bit of like what it looks like when refineries and petroleum facilities have far less regulations than the ones in the Bay Area, which are subject to the strictest ones in at least the country, maybe the world. Well, there's probably some in Europe that have greater regulation, but in any event, the microscope is much, much hotter on Chevron now. And so every time they have the flare, all the channels open up. All the community backlash is sparked again. We also have monitoring stations all around the facility. And so there's real-time air quality data that can be gathered. And so the slightest uptick is not only available to authorities and experts, it goes to the public as well. And the public gets it, and they share it, and they do what they do with the modern communication tools that they have, and that creates a greater reaction. Now, some might see this all as a very virtuous setup, right, where you get more and more feedback, more and more backlash to call it bad behavior by the refinery, thus more incentives for more investment to clean up the process. All true. At the same time, it's something that causes a great deal of distress in the community, right? That has its own levels of trauma, of anxiety.
Recording
It
in
sparks
progress.
inward. You get on, you'll find the various chat rooms and groups on Facebook and so forth where Richmonders are talking, and what was a drop in the bucket of what people were accustomed to 30 years ago is now something that's a cataclysmic event for that day. It certainly dominates the news that day. What else is going on in Richmond? Housing and homelessness. Huge. Another example of where Richmond is oftentimes an even magnified example of trends that are going on across the country. The homeless problem, I'm here to tell you, is a crisis, and it's one that we in government, whether it's in county, whether it's in cities, we don't have solutions for it. It's really hard. It's really complicated, and it's especially complicated by the lack of resources that we have to do something with it. Even if we had all the resources we needed, it would still be a difficult problem. It would still be complicated. And we'll talk about why. But we don't. And so what we have is the reality. The reality is that there are hundreds, thousands of homeless people in Contra Costa County, probably over 1,000 in Richmond. The census counts can never be totally reliable for obvious reasons. And people bivouac on freeway sides or BART tracks or behind businesses. And they get larger and larger encampments. And what might you think that happens when large encampments begin to gather? And almost, if we all gathered in a large encampment, we'd have problems. But imagine if the vast majority of us had substance abuse problems or mental illness. And then we were all packed into a very dire, very deprivation situation. You can imagine. Violence, anxiety, trauma, sickness, disease, all of it rampant. That's going on, and the best that we can do at this time is like hope that it stays out of sight. And when it does get into sight, somebody complains about it. In sight means by someone who lives somewhere. They complain about it, and then people run out and they try to displace. They try to move them somewhere else where they're having less of an impact on nearby residents. So it's a whack-a-mole game, and it's going on right now. And that is part of a lack of imagination, but I think the biggest reason, frankly, is a lack of resources. And that's the best that your governments can do. And it's sad, and it's not good enough. And it's a story that ought to be told more and more, because as we know, this is one of those areas where media comes in. You know, according to the theoretical chart, media comes in, exposes things, prods government, industry, and others to do better. Homelessness wasn't even an issue in 2009 that we thought about at all. It was there, but the numbers were small enough that it was something that could be sort of out of sight and out of mind. Dumping. This is kind of funny. I don't know if anybody knows about this issue. A lot of people are like, what do you mean dumping? There's a part of it is homeless related, but not all of it. There is a massive crisis. It's an environmental crisis, it's a health crisis, it's a community crisis. It's a massive crisis in terms of unregulated disposal of waste, right? It's happening everywhere, and it's costing, of course, the public and the environment a good deal. It's also costing a tremendous amount of money. And that money is being spent in a backdoor way. Nobody wants to pass budgets that are able to account for this, but when the crisis occurs, there's a massive pile of something somewhere that somebody's complaining about, we wind up paying to pick it up anyway. So why is this happening? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but the biggest single reason, I think, is the cost of disposal. The cost of disposal has become higher as we try to better handle waste in a way that's more sustainable and better for the environment. That's great. The cost to that is it's a powerful incentive for people to just bypass that and dump it for free. Dump it on the public. There's your externality. There's your free rider problem. The economics textbook tell you all about it. We're living it right here in Richmond. It doesn't sound like a really glamorous story, but it's one that has a lot of weight to it. It's one that enterprising stories and reporters can really dig into and advance public policy in a meaningful way. It's a challenging story. District elections. This is something we didn't have in Richmond before. It's interesting. Richmond has 7 council members and a mayor. Historically, they've all been at large voted in, which means it's just the votes of all the people, and the highest vote getters get to get in their seat. Activists didn't like that, and they felt that certain neighborhoods in Richmond were being neglected. And I don't disagree. And many neighborhoods in Richmond were also greatly overrepresented by council members. I wrote a story in the Contra Costa Times 5 years ago where Point Richmond, the relatively affluent enclave of 3,000 people, was home to 4 of the 7 city council members. The 97,000 people who lived in the rest of Richmond, who weren't as wealthy, white, and old by the demographic data, to speak crudely, they were represented by 3 council members, a minority. Obviously an untenable situation, and part of what spurred the switch to district elections. So now council members are voted in to represent a specific district. Is that a panacea? Is everything good now? Certainly not. Dig into it more, but there are a lot of issues that come with this kind of this kind of turf representation. And then the big question is, what's the turf that's represented? Always the biggest question in proportional representation, or district representation, is how are the lines drawn? I'll leave it at that for you to look into. How were those lines drawn? Point Melodic, huge issue. I don't know if everybody's heard of it, but there is an old naval depot that's on the coast of Richmond. It's a beautiful natural resource. There is some contaminants in the ground. Go to Point Melodic Beach and check it out sometime. It's a great beach. It was reopened. I go there with my family sometimes. It was reopened in 2014 or 15 or so, after many years of being closed. Point Melodic is a jewel of coastal land in the Bay Area. Probably none other like it remaining. Probably the last bastion. And there are powerful forces on one side of the council who want to develop this into a massive tract of luxury homes with open space. I don't want to cast that as the bad guy. That's one idea. And there's others who are intent on making this a park. And not only preserving the open space, but also making a host of other improvements to preserve the last great urban coastal region of land in the Bay Area. So that's a fantastic story, a complicated one, a great deal at stake, hundreds of millions of dollars. It also dovetails into the housing issue, which is a massive issue, right? We need housing. I will just say one more thing about housing. The big thing is, what is the problem with housing? At its absolute core, there are many, but housing is an issue of supply. We see this all the time. We don't have enough, and the demand is greatly exceeded. And that pressure continues to build upward. Thus, the price goes higher. It's impossible to meet that demand because it's so hard to build new housing, especially in these inner city cores where we need it. We don't want to sprawl more. We want to get taller and smaller and denser so that we can use transit hubs, we can reduce emissions, we can be more efficient. But every time you want to build anything, the odds are stacked against you. It's really, really hard to do. So look into housing as well. And in 2009, the problem was a surplus of housing. Vacant houses were everywhere. They were all, the blight of vacant houses and of people taking them over, that was the big public policy issue. And it's completely flipped around 12 years later. Defund the police, police issues, the current police department, the police chief, all of this stuff, excellent. Like I said, Richmond was sort of counter-cyclical with the rest of the country in terms of a city, a very diverse city, a city with very high crime concerns, but one where the police department, by and large, seemed to be getting things right, or at least had the general support of the public, more so than in most. That's sort of still the case, but it's being eroded a little bit. Even though the crime is down, it's being eroded by, there's more and more political will and public will for reducing police budgets. And the police chief and her staff, you know, they don't want to lose that part of their pie. And the question is defunding this police department in this place at this time the right public safety, public policy decision? Or is it an ill fit for this place and time?
Recording in progress.
Great question. The police chief herself, I wrote a very large profile about her years ago before she was the chief, when she was the assistant chief. And she's a fascinating person. First African-American female ever to lead this department. In fact, I believe the first in the Bay Area. And came from very humble beginnings, worked her way up from the bottom at the department, and is now leading it. And is a fascinating person and somebody that you should make acquaintance with if you can. Lastly, public schools. In 2009, the story was badly performing old public schools that used to have glory. Basically, Richmond High, Kennedy High, rich traditions, and now defunded, poorly performing, not good places for kids. That was the story in 2009. Today, the story is rapidly falling enrollment in public schools. And the new options, typically charters, stepping into that vacuum and providing, it's controversial, but they have a lot of adherence. There's a lot of people, especially people from backgrounds where they and their families in previous generations in Richmond did not do well in the old public schools, had bad outcomes over and over again, and now suddenly in 2021, kids in these same families are going to college, and they're graduating the top of their class, and they're doing well, and they're crediting it to this new charter model. Very controversial. I'm not saying that one's better than the other, but there are pros and cons on both sides. And it's really happening, and it's really gaining foot speed.
These are publicly funded charter schools.
Yes, publicly funded charter schools. So, again, Richmond, microcosm of America. Sea level change, environmental degradation, climate change, schools, income inequality, shifting economies. What's not getting enough coverage? Well, I'd say everything, to put it simply. But in particular, I'd note housing development. This is a story that scares a lot of people off because it's pretty complicated. Oftentimes, it's not easy to get into. But what are the roots of our housing crisis here in the Bay Area? You can answer that question for the Bay Area in Richmond.
Robert, is there? Sorry to interrupt. Real quick, but, is there an example of a developer that really wanted to build something and couldn't just because it was just too complicated and abandoned the plan? But if they had they done it, there would have been all these houses available. Or
absolutely.
So there's a lot of those.
Yeah, and it's one of those strange bedfellows situations. There was one, and anybody reach out to me in email and I get you the details. But there was one. It was in the annex, And the idea was, it was a great project from my point of view. Tall, small, near transit, just fantastic. But it was near another community, like they all are, when we're trying to do infill development. And this particular community was very relatively affluent, very progressive. It was your typical older white progressives who are progressive on all the issues down the line. But when it came to building low-income housing right there in their community that made sense for a variety of reasons, they were out there with pitchforks. And why, right? It was traffic, noise, parking, right? All of these, really kind of retrograde issues. And look, and I'll be very frank, right? In Supervisor Joya's office, we hear concerns about parking all the time whenever we want to develop anything. And we're pretty, we always want to meet with our constituents and do the best we can, but also he's elected to lead, and he wants to lead. And so on this issue, he leads. He says no. If we're going to meet our climate goals, if we're going to meet our emission goals, if we are going to save the world, basically, we're going to need to sacrifice. And making accommodations for more cars in all of our new development is not the way we want to go. We want to develop infrastructure that links people with transit and disincentivizes cars. And the last thing we want is mandating 2 or 3 parking slots for every apartment unit. And that's a huge sticking point that often stops development. And sometimes, oftentimes you wind up at loggerheads on issues like this, and you've just got to show leadership. Other issues really quick, look into the post-COVID environment for urban retail downtowns. The city of Richmond had a downtown that was the envy of West County in the post-war era. There's pictures all over the museum. It's beautiful, right? Where working class people in Richmond, fresh off the war and their wages going higher, were shopping at department stores in downtown Richmond and wearing their Sunday best, and it was fantastic. And then the 60s and 70s came, and downtowns got disinvested, and suburban sprawl came on, and Hilltop Mall became the new rage. And a big mall was built in the mid-70s, and it killed downtown, the big mall on the outskirts. And that's a story that was repeated all over the country. Come full circle. Today, the mall, Hilltop, look it up, it's a ghost town, right? It's literally, it's all closed. A massive mall, more than 1 million square feet, is empty. It's like a museum piece. It's gonna wind up getting demolished, and hopefully housing goes there. That's what we want. But then there's the idea of bring it back downtown, and that's good. I sit on the downtown improvement board also, so we're excited about that. But then COVID comes, and now we know the future is not retail storefronts, right? At least not by themselves. The future is about logistics, delivery. People are going to get goods different ways. So what are downtowns going to be able to do to adapt? To not go to another death knell like they did in the 60s and 70s. You have to look at new models, services, gathering points. What can be provided in a downtown environment that can't be better produced somewhere else? What's going to invite people downtown? And it might be things like amphitheaters and performance and services and so forth. But that's a struggle that's going on all over the country. What are we going to do? Because all these cities, they rely on these tax revenues as well. So this is a major issue, and it's one that's really exciting because we don't really know the answer. There's a lot of theories, and there's a general idea. Like I said, generally, we're going to see a reduction in commercial retail space. We know that. But what's it going to look like in its place? And you can see that right there downtown. Another one, transportation. Some people love transportation. It's a rich topic. I understand people really geek out on it, really hobbyists. It's great. The BART station is downtown. AC transit running routes all over the place. Our defined route public transit system is in big trouble. There's a problem. Nobody talks about it. There's a little inside scoop for you. They're all riding around, for the most part, empty. Okay? The buses are practically empty in Richmond. The BART, you see it now. I wrote it here today. And it's okay, got a few more people when we went to downtown Berkeley, of course. But it's empty in Richmond and in El Segundo del Norte. I was on a call with BART leaders last week, and they said ridership is still under 10% of what it was pre-pandemic level, total. In the meantime, what's risen, and it's not just everybody staying home all the time. What's risen in its place? How are people getting around? Right? You guys know the answer. It's about non-defined route ride sharing, right? You know, the day will come soon enough when the autonomous cars will be circling around everywhere and you'll just pick it up. What's that going to do to define route transit? This is a big policy question they're wrestling with, and it has huge implications for the city of Richmond with a downtown BART station. In 2009, the big discussion was, are we going to build on the 2009, or the BART station downtown? Are we going to build extensions beyond it? Because it's just a spur. Nobody's talking about that now. Now, I mean, nobody's saying this, but you know, one has to hope that BART station doesn't become obsolete at some point.
So, I mean, is there other stuff that Richmond BART has that would keep it viable, or is there ever a threat that they might shut that down at some point in the distant future?
I certainly don't. There's certainly nothing in the near future.
Yeah. And
I don't think so. But and they certainly wouldn't say so. But you know, the reality is,
you need riders. Yeah.
Riders are at a fraction. Now they get subsidies, that helps, but those subsidies won't last forever. What are we going to do? And what are defined, bigger picture, what are defined route transit, which we love because of their efficiency in some ways, right? Pack a lot of people on a train in the BART, and that's a really efficient way to move people, right? Like 100 times better than getting in your car by yourself. But if they meet obsolescence because of better, more nimble options, more efficient options, then we're going to have a real problem, right? At least with that legacy infrastructure. I don't think that's going to happen. I hope not. But BART needs all defined route transit agencies need to rise and meet challenges and figure out how to become relevant and useful to their riders now and tomorrow. What should we dispel about Richmond? I like this. Now, I had a few questions that Jeremy wanted me to make sure that I covered, so I will. Richmond is not particularly dangerous. Okay? My story earlier, notwithstanding, it's just a city. It's just a place. There's just people there. I never feel the slightest bit unease. I take little kids downtown. Everything's fine. The stats suggest a little more dangerous, maybe, than Walnut Creek, but more dangerous than Concord? No. And what is danger, right? Danger, we're talking about, again, total fractions. When you go to Richmond, the most dangerous thing that you're doing in going to Richmond, your most dangerous activity will surely be your car ride or your bike ride there. That's the dangerous part. Right? So don't worry about Richmond's danger per se. Chevron doesn't dominate the city. It used to. The coup de grace was in 2014 when they pumped millions into their Moving Forward campaign, trying to basically depose the whole city council and retake control. And that was when Richmond Confidential really rose to that particular cohort, and I happen to have been serving as the instructor that year. They really took that on. And that was when the LA Times columnist called it some of the most important journalism going on anywhere in the country. And that was when one of our reporters on Bill Moyers told the whole story. We were on Rachel Maddow and so forth. And we had a real issue of David and Goliath kind of story, right? And we know that those are the kinds of stories that are compelling. And since then, Chevron has retrenched and they backed off. Richmond is a diverse place, but it's not just African American, Caucasian, and Latino. That's kind of what the census data will sort of look like. but it's everything, right? There's Pacific Islander and Asian communities, Laotian communities. Of course, various different, to say Latino is just one of, there's Salvadoran and Ecuadorian, all kinds of folks. Richmond's an extremely diverse place, and it's one of the really exciting things about it. Historically, up until the 70s, Richmond was majority African American, and it still has, that's a rich part of its culture. But like many cities across the country, there's been a rapid change. Over the last 30 years, a lot of African American families have moved east to Antioch and Pittsburgh. Those are the biggest destinations. And a lot of other people have moved in. And so it's constantly changing. And these demographic shifts, they're exciting. But there's also, it's not all great, it's not all rosy. There are churches and civic institutions that wind up closing because they don't have the same congregations anymore. There are businesses that have to adapt and change. So the demographic shift is always an exciting story. It's always a human story. And it's one to look into. There's infinite ways to look into it. What really captures the spirit of Richmond? Where would I say, where should you go if you want to get to know Richmond a little bit? I assume most of you don't know a lot about Richmond, but get out there, get your feet wet. It's always important to get out in the community, no matter what kind of reporting you're doing. I'd say go to Point Richmond, of course. Really beautiful historic district, nice flavor there. Go to downtown Richmond. You're going to see a lot of exciting stuff going on, a lot of bicycles.
What intersection would you go for downtown? Like, if they want to go to downtown?
Sure,
Richmond?
downtown. I mean by that, like McDonald and between like the BART station, I think it's 13th, and like Harbor Way to the west. That's old historic downtown. And it's a pretty exciting place, lots going on. A little less exciting than it was pre-pandemic, but it's great. Go to North Richmond, absolutely. North Richmond, very proud community. It's unincorporated pocket. It has a feeling of isolation. It's a fence-line community. It's right next to the Chevron Refinery. You get an idea of what it's like to live beneath the shadows of a global petrochemical behemoth, like the people there always have. It's a very poor community. Used to flood until 30 years ago. The levees are still vulnerable. So you'll get a lot in North Richmond. Check that out. 23rd Street, fantastic. Also known as kind of the Latino business district. Great restaurants, great services, great, just great culture. It's too bad Cinco de Mayo is not going on now, but when it does have the biggest Cinco de Mayo celebration in the Bay Area, over 10,000 people. Of course, take the BART to Richmond. Not only is it good to take the BART to Richmond, and it takes you downtown, that's great, but also it gives you a vantage point, a bird's eye view as it sort of careens to the left, banking to the left on the elevated tracks. You get kind of a spread of Richmond. It's not quite a helicopter ride, but it's quite good. Go to Catahoula Coffee on San Pablo. It's like a place where the movers and shakers hang out. It's got a lot. You'll meet people there who know a lot about Richmond, who are really passionate about their community. Go to Point Malate Beach. I mentioned that earlier. Go to Casper's and CJ's next to the City Hall. That's on McDonald. It's right around. Casper's is the hot dog stand, and CJ's is the barbecue fish and chips across the street. Both of these places, great food, but also great people and institutions that have been in Richmond for a long, long time. I don't know exactly, but I'm going to say 50 years. What's the relationship with Chevron like recently? We covered this quickly. It's better. Chevron, like I said, has retrenched. They gave up after they were smote in 2014. However, since then, they passed a modernization project. And that included millions in funding for the community. That's good. And always remember, Chevron gives a lot of money to the community. Now, some will say not nearly enough, but it does. And money wins you friends also. And money also can do good. And those things are part of the story as well. But Chevron put $1 billion into a modernization of their refinery, which is still ongoing, but they started that a couple of years ago. And that, in my mind, along with the strategic importance of the location, the biggest and only West Coast, other than El Segundo, the only West Coast port It gets crude oil from the Middle East and Alaska, and they refine it here. And the crude they refine there is crucial to California, because one of the reasons why California's gas is higher than everywhere else, because our gas is cleaner. We have more regulations on what can be in it. It's part of why we're not as smoggy as we were in the 70s and 80s. But that makes it cost more as well. But Chevron provides that gas, a big part of it. Not many refineries do. So that, along with the location and the billion-dollar modernization, anybody who says Chevron's leaving anytime soon, highly unlikely. We don't know what's happening in the future. Now, there's another refinery up, this is called the Refinery Belt, by the way, in Contra Costa. There's 5 refineries, or maybe 4 now, that are along the delta, starting with Chevron going east. It's a fascinating part of the story as well. And it's all it's the delta, it's because of the shipping routes. One of them just closed last year, I believe it was the Tesoro refinery. And it's all about retooling toward modern and cleaner emissions. The solar panel fields are already encroaching all around Chevron. And they're doing it in other places too. And other forms of energy. So that is the future. But there will still be a demand for special California blended gasoline. And Chevron made a massive investment in ensuring that they're there to provide it. So I don't think it's going anywhere.
Another trip I was just thinking of, if you're up to it, if anybody ever has to go to Sacramento for any reason, is the Amtrak Capital Corridor. Taking Amtrak and sit on the left side of the train, you're going to see the Delta, and it's just spectacular views. It's really fast. Well, I guess you can sit on the other side because you'll miss the Richmond side too. And so, but that's just that trip on Amtrak goes through Richmond and goes through the whole Delta. It kind of goes up along the coast, right on the edge of the water. And you see people fishing out there, and it just looks so dangerous because it's literally right on this little cliff. But it's a really incredible view. So if you ever have to go to Sacramento for any reason, that's a good trip. Yeah.
It is a fantastic route. Check it out. You'll also see most of the refineries on the Delta.
I was curious what your opinion or thoughts were on the Richmond Standard.
Oh, great.
Funded by Chevron.
Great question. I was not supposed to say that. When the Richmond Standard launched in 2013 or 14, it was right when they were making their power grab for the city. And they launched this website, this faux news website, right? It certainly masquerades as objective news. And at the time, there was a real battle, a real animosity between what we were doing here and what they were doing there. And we were pitted against each other by the LA Times and others, saying, essentially part of our worth was as a counter to this kind of nefarious faux news, corporate-funded rag that was stepping into the breach left by legacy media in the area, right? A really apocalyptic look. And so a lot of that's true. And all of the ethical concerns about that certainly hold true. And they also have been borne out in reality. Someone did a study at one point where they looked at every time there's a negative issue with Chevron, the flaring is the most obvious one, but there's others where they funded somebody's campaign, or they spilled something somewhere, or they're fighting. A few years ago, they were fighting paying their tax bill to the county. All these things. Every time something like that happens, the Richmond Standard, the news site, is eerily silent on that topic, right? So they certainly do their work by omission. They choose not to do much editorially, or they don't do anything pro-Chevron. What they do, however, is they do highlight a lot of good work being done by nonprofits, and then not in the headline or the lead, but a little ways down, they'll insert several references to Chevron funding it, right? So they're trying to be subtle, and to some degree they are. What would the average resident who's not really up on all this think when they look at the Richmond Standard? They don't think much about that. They just think about the news. And the Richmond Standard, to its credit, their editor is a pretty smart guy. He focuses on stuff like high school sports and kids who are doing amazing stuff, profiles on talented kids, and of course community activities, concerts, so forth. A lot of cultural stuff. And he does a lot of crime because he knows he can drive clicks with the crime stories. Lots of crime stories. So the Standard looks like your news and it becomes your destination for news in Richmond, but you're never going to get any bad news about Chevron. And maybe sometimes you need that. And so the degree to which you rely on the Standard for your news is the degree to which you're going to be in the dark about your biggest corporate neighbor and what it's doing. And unlike most corporate neighbors, what it's doing may directly impact your health. So, that's my opinion. I look at stories at the Standard sometimes. Sometimes I even share them. I do. Sometimes I even tweet. If I see a Standard story that's about, I saw one the other day where it was some little girl who did an amazing recital or something. I tweeted it. And I liked it. Maybe I shouldn't. I'm not sure. Maybe I should give them no comfort. But I did. But my point is, I know what's going on there, and most of us do, but some don't. And is it as nefarious as it could have been? Maybe not. But has it supplanted other news sources? No, it hasn't been successful, I don't think, in that respect, right? Because you can't control the narrative. There's too much going on there. When I said, if you relied on the Standard for all your news, you would see it this way, right? A world where Chevron never does anything wrong and they just fund good stuff. Well, fortunately, I don't think anybody really relies on it to that degree, right? Anybody who's reading the Standard is probably also seeing their Facebook feed with their friends and so forth. And every time Chevron does something bad, the hornet's nest gets opened up.
I was wondering, I know you have a lot here, but I wanted to give some space for some Q&A. And
Okay.
an opportunity. I don't know if you have any last things that you wanted to.
I do. Time is it now?
We have about 20 minutes if you want to end at
Gotcha.
6:30. Yeah.
Okay, let's transition into Q&A.
I have a question. I'll start
Yeah.
off.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition from journalism to working in government and supervisor? And I know we've had a handful of students over the years make that transition. And can you talk a little bit about what that's like, how it's been fulfilling in some ways, and maybe how it's been like especially since we're off the record, has it ever challenged you ethically or something where you feel like, because I know that you believe in what you're doing, but I don't know if you've ever had a situation where it's like, you're like, oh, I got to do it for the better good, or.
Yep. So I come from a tradition, and I don't know if you guys do. I don't know if that's really pervasive anymore. It was when I was an undergrad in like the early 2000s, and then when I came to J school in 2009, and before that, of course, as well. There was very much a antithetical approach to journalism and politics or government, right? These were very much things that were at odds and should be at odds, and it wasn't quite as puerile as they're the bad guys and we're the good guys, but it was close, right? It's kind of like that. That was the tradition I came through in journalism training, and then I adopted that in my professional life. Working for the San Bernardino County Sun, and then for the Contra Costa Times, and with News 21, and before I always saw the government as adversarial, trying to hide something from me, something that I needed to catch all the time to expose something. And it's definitely important to have a healthy dose of that. But at the same time, you can't let that color all your views all the time. You have to be open-minded. It's not always as simple as the government's being the bad guy, or all politicians are not bad. Not all the time at least. Just as much as any other person or institution. So, I have ethics, and I imagine you do too, otherwise you wouldn't be here. When I wasn't seeking out this job, I had been working as a journalist until 2003, 4 years as a journalist out of J school. I graduated J school, I stuck around for a fellowship, and then I took a job at the Contra Costa Times. Prior to that, I worked in journalism as well. And it was great. And I was covering Richmond and West County, and I was impassioned, and I was energized, and it was going on 4 years. And during that time, I got to know John Joya, the county supervisor. And he was always one of those politicians that took my calls, and was always helpful. and seemed open and pointed me in directions and all these things. Developed a rapport. And I had no intention of making a move at that time. But then he asked me if I would come work for him. And I thought about it, and my family was changing at the time, and I always joke, if it was anybody else that I was working with regularly at that time, basically meaning Richmond politicians and other county supervisors, the answer would have been no out of hand, right? Because I didn't trust any of them, really. But he seemed different. And I told him right off the bat, I'll never lie, obviously. And he said, he's almost offended. I would never ask him to. And so we went into it, and it's been fantastic so far. I really enjoyed it. I'm energized. Now, one thing that's crucial is I'm a storyteller at heart, and I imagine you guys are also. And that means, you name the platform, you name the technology. I like videos and pictures, and I like writing, and I like all those things. And I like people to see what I produce. I like it all. And I do external communications for the office. So I get to scratch that itch all the time. I'm doing communication, mass communication all the time. You get on our newsletter list, all that stuff is me, for the most part. Supervisor Roy's Twitter handle, look at all. We produce video content, we produce photos, we do all this. So I really enjoy it. Now, it's a different kind of communication, okay? I don't want to call it propaganda, but we value truth like you value truth. Like I used to value truth. But now in this role, I have to think a little more about discretion. My approach as a journalist was pretty radical, right? It was basically tell the truth, though the heavens may fall. If I'm paraphrasing an old scripture line. But it basically was, it ain't my job to know how the chips are going to fall here. My job is to tell the truth as I see it, right? I'm not worried about repercussions, ramifications, and so forth. Fearless truth-telling. And that's important in journalism. And I think that needs to drive you. And I'm not saying there's not discretion sometimes for everybody. We all should have some, sure. But we want to be leaning toward that end if we're doing good journalism. Which is, look, it's not your job to think about how the information is going to impact, this politician or that person or that institution or whatever. Your job is to tell the truth the way you find it. In political office, I have to think about those things more. And it's not so much just, you might think it's all self-serving about, the candidate or the public image or whatever. But it's all, what I'm really thinking about mostly in discretion is I'm often thinking about, is this information who is it going to hurt, if anyone? And is this going to impede something that we need to do that we think is right to do, right? If we're trying to advance a policy that we think is going to benefit the public, and that's what Supervisor Joy is elected to do, how can I convey information in a way that doesn't jeopardize that goal? So that's the kind of thing that I do. Now many in journalism would find that unsatisfying. They would find that unacceptable. And I may have found that unacceptable when I was 25. But now I don't. Now I like that, I understand that, and I appreciate that value. But at the very core, I'm able to tell stories. And that's what keeps me energized, keeps me happy. And by the way, I'll just say this, it was the experience that I had here with Jeremy and with so many others in the Berkeley J School that prepared me for this, right? Berkeley J School made me a much better journalist, of course. Made me a successful journalist in some ways. It also has made me a better person and a better public official. And I really, really value the opportunities that I had here. And I think that you'll find that the same. In 30 years, not all of you will be doing the same thing, or 20 years, you're not all going to be doing the same thing. And I think even as time goes on, there'll be more and more opportunities that are sort of journalism-like, if you will. So I think that it's going to be more and more common for J schoolers to go on to have really successful careers in non-traditional communications environments, more so than in the past. And that's okay. We have to adapt. We have to think about how we can do great work that makes the world a better place. And that's not always working at a newspaper or working on a documentary crew or whatever. It could be other things too.
Anyone have any questions? This is your opportunity. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kayla. First of all, thank you. And I'm also in communications, so I echo that message, and it was a great way for me to blend my nonprofit work with my journalism, so I agree. My beat is homelessness, and you mentioned a big concern about health and safety, which I'm sure has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I'm wondering is there a specific clinic or team or group in the community that is serving the needs of the health concerns of unhoused communities?
Great question, and yes. Now, there's a whole range of nonprofits and other institutions that do some of this work. Now, here's the best part, and this is very gratifying. Working with Supervisor Joy, we're really passionate about this issue. We advanced the policy at the Board of Supervisors where we were one of the first counties that got the funding, and then we created what's called the core outreach teams. And so what we did is we created a whole new department, we staffed it up, hired all these people, and we have core outreach teams, which means whether you're a city or a business or a resident or whatever, you can call them and they're going to come out and they're going to engage homeless residents, whether there's one mentally ill man or physically ill man on the street corner, or whether it's a whole camp that's by the railroad tracks. They're going to go out there, they're going to engage them, and they're really good. They're mental health professionals. And they're going to offer them the whole suite of services. They're plugged in. It's important to know the whole network. It's others. You realize in government, especially now more than ever, it's so decentralized. It's so complex. It's a web. And you have to know how to navigate the web to be effective. And these folks do. So they let people know they assess, let them know the range of services, and then try to persuade them to access those services. And what you find, by the way, is one of the real challenges in home populations is so often, it's true, it's cliche, but it's true. So often people don't want the services. It's true. Now, that doesn't mean they all don't. And these teams do a lot of good, and they help a lot of people, and people get turned around. They get into transitional housing, and they turn their lives around. That happens a lot too. So that's the answer to your question is the core team, and I can always give you more. Reach out anytime.
There's a great movie with Robert Downey Jr. and Jamie Foxx called The Soloist, and it shows just how hard, everyone thinks, oh, it's so easy. I could just take somebody off the street and help them get their life together. It's so complex, and that's just one person. And if you want to do this with an entire community, it's there's an intense amount of assistance that some people need, and so it's an extraordinary. It just really illustrates just how in our minds it's I just need to help somebody out, get them a job, get them cleaned up, and they'll be fine. It's it's an intense and very resource intensive process, and so that's why it's so difficult now.
Totally true, Jeremy. Well said. One really key thing that I learned. I remember when I got the job in government and I left journalism. I remember the first thing I thought to myself, I was so excited. Now I'm going to be in all those meetings I couldn't get in before. I'm going to find out where all the bodies are buried. I have a real subversive outlook about that. I didn't think that I would come in and pull the curtain down and everything, but I thought I'm going to have access now. And you know what I found when I got in? It really wasn't as I envisioned. There are cases where people are doing bad things, politicians are being self-serving, people are asleep at the switch. A lot of that stuff's happening. But most of the time, what I see, and this is at the county level, this is nonpartisan, nobody's worried about what's on Fox News or whatever. There's none of that ideological thing going on. This is about bread and butter stuff. How do we make our communities better? And what I found, the vast majority of the time, is there's no grand wizard behind the veil in government. There's just a bunch of people trying to do their best, and it's not always good enough. It's hard to do. The word good. When you're on the outside, as a journalist, it's really easy, and I do it all the time. It's really easy to say, there's a big problem. Look at that grotesque inequality, all those people on the railroad tracks, and these fat cats in government letting it happen. And now I'm going to go in and find out what's going on, expose it, write great stories, and change things. That was my approach. But it's a lot more nuanced than that. And when I got in, I realized, like, most of it is people doing their best, not having enough resources, and it's hard to solve these problems. That's why they're there.
We have time for maybe one more question. Oh wow! Everybody's like, get my question in now. We'll try.
We do a rapid fire.
Yeah, let's do a rapid fire.
Go ahead.
Okay, I have a problem. I have a question. My name is Olivia. I'm from Sarah's class. Thank you so much for talking to us. It's been very inspiring. My question is actually about the story that's not getting enough coverage. You mentioned about the autonomous cars that's been coming. I was wondering, like off record, what are the policies now regarding the autonomous?
Can you just repeat the question real quick? Yeah.
She's asking, what are the policies about autonomous cars? And this is definitely a situation at our government level and many others where the policies are behind the technology, right? And so that's going to be, it's going to come to the fore, and as usual, it's going to get there, they're going to be ready to go, and then governments are going to scramble to try to fashion policies after the fact, right? After the genie's out of the bottle. So, we don't have specific ordinances on driverless cars. I know, and the IT guy that comes to my office once a week is driving a Tesla that is basically autonomous. He's sitting in the driver's seat and is driving itself down Highway 4. Is that technically legal in our county or by the CHP? I'm not really sure. I think it is, but and then when it does, there's going to be interest groups on all sides, right? There's going to be taxi services, and there's going to be defined route transit, and they're going to be trying to put the kibosh on relaxing standards on autonomous vehicles. It's just like what we've seen with Uber and Lyft as well. So the short answer to your question is there is no policy to my knowledge. This is coming fast, and it's a great story to look into more.
I'm Sabrina. I'm covering public safety in Richmond this semester, and you mentioned like Richmond is different than like other cities when it comes to police. And I'm interested, what do you think are the implications of defunding the police department there? And I know that they've already passed to reallocate $3 million for the police department, so I'm just interested to know more about your thoughts.
Well, there is a real reduction in personnel on the street. They have people retire and get injured, they don't fill positions. There are less police out there than there were a couple of years ago. Has that equated to a spike in crime? There's not been a big spike. To what degree is that attributed to the kinds of increases we've seen? Don't know. That would require some in-depth reporting. What do I think? I think that in all likelihood, this reduction in manpower is probably not going to cause an increase in crime at these levels, but it is causing stress and morale problems at the police department. And if that organization gets sicker, there could be ramifications on the street.
Hi, my name is Hotel, and we actually spoke earlier this week, so thank you. And I'm covering the board of supervisors actually, and so one of the things that I'm trying to look into is more with regards to youth and sort of, like what are the main issues affecting youth, particularly in a district like Richmond, right? It's like such like diverse, like kind of just demographically diverse like space, and sort of like with their own specific needs, and so how the board approaches working with youth and specifically like whether that's through the lens of education or just like other centers. I know we spoke a little bit about the Rice Center, but like just more broadly, like what are some issues affecting youth?
The board doesn't do enough. The county doesn't play enough of a role with youth throughout the county. Now, there are reasons for that, but the question of the wellness of youth in our communities across the county is a complicated one that's intersected by so many different institutions. The schools, the school district, that's its own government, the cities in which they live, and of course the county as well, and then of course all the nonprofits and other institutions. Then there's the charter schools. So all of this, the question of what's the health of our youth in the county is a great question. I know my own son who goes to school in West County, a public school. They stopped giving homework when they returned from COVID. They're worried about stress on the students from the last year, right? That's one example. So we have students that are feeling stressed. They're feeling like they don't have enough resources. School districts are stressed. We're not sure how they're intersecting. On the bright side, like we talked about, Supervisor Joya and the board got tremendous amounts of funding for the RISE Center, which is like a nationally recognized model, and it's really exciting. But I would say look into what the board's doing with regard to youth, and more important, figure out what it is that's going on with youth in Richmond today. What are the issues that are really facing them? You know, it's easy for us to say lack of resources, lack of after-school programs and so forth. That's the stock answer. But is that really true? It's certainly, as you'll always find, the truth is more nuanced.
For Richmond Confidential, do you see us translating to other news mediums? Like, should we get a YouTube or a TikTok?
That's a good question, right? I definitely don't want to step on
No.
the rest or so. You know, in my mind, yes, absolutely, right? I mean, news organizations have got to be massive social platform players. And that's how you reach your audience. And so, and it's not pro forma. It's not as simple as just pumping out your content on those other things. You know, 20 years ago, we got the websites, right? More than that. And newspapers said, well, we print these awesome newspapers, and now we have this website, and so we'll put the newspaper on the website, right? And how'd that work out? Right? Was that innovative? No, right? It was bad. And then they were way behind when it came time to make websites that drew eyeballs. And the Craigslist and everybody else passed them right up. It's the same thing with this. If you're in the business of providing news coverage, you have to provide it on all the mediums that are available to you. You have to learn where your audience is and then go get them. Now, I know that we were doing Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, at least those four. We were doing those in 2014. And I know that I follow all of yours. I know they're still there. Should you get on TikTok or should you get on what was the other one?
Snapchat.
Snapchat. I mean, I don't know. Full disclosure, the game's passed me by. I'm not on either of those. But my guess would be, yeah. That's where people are. That's where we need to be with our content, engaging them.
Cool.
Since you're on the inside of county government, what's the general county culture when it comes to responding to media or like receiving media requests? I know you go to some cities and counties and it's like an iron wall except for one entry point. Any suggestions for us to navigate that?
Yep. Well, the county is big and it's risk averse. And so I think the culture generally is probably pretty, pretty, I don't want to say standoffish, but they're not very nimble. However, the beauty is, that's why the elected officials are always so, and you're going to see this at any level of government, right? Cracking the bureaucracy is always much more difficult than the politicians, the elected officials, because they're closer to the people by nature. That's a good thing. So, I'll speak for our office, and I'll say that, priority one is to be available to the press as much as possible, as transparent as possible. And anybody needs Supervisor Joy anytime, just let me know, and we'll get that hooked up. We already got you going, Alfredo. So the culture in our office, all the way. The culture in the other district offices, I don't know for sure, but they seem, I don't see them in there nearly as much as John Joya, but I think they're pretty open. The culture at the county administrator's office, for instance, is going to be bureaucratic. It's going to be like a few channels, and it's so I won't say that it's anti-press and lock them down and Nixon-esque, but it's cumbersome.
Would it be easier then to start with like the supervisors
Yes.
and then go that way?
If you make a relationship with Supervisor Joya, and then he refers you to some other agency to get more information, they'll be more responsive. Are we okay too?
Yeah. I mean, I'm okay with time. I don't want to keep you too late. Why don't we do 2 more rapid fire questions?
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. So I have a pretty broad question. It's regarding Richmond Mayor Tom Budd. So he's been brought in controversy concerning he's called for the firing of city managers, city attorney, etc. I was just curious for your general thoughts.
Simple lowball softball question.
I'm sorry, you said my thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Well, So Mayor Tom Butt has been on the council since like the early 90s. And to his credit, he never changed. He's the same person. He came into this, he was right here in this library 12 years ago for our inaugural session. We invited him in, and he came in and we all peppered him with questions. And we hit him pretty hard. It was pretty good. And he did okay. At that time, he was obsessed with a bulkhead of a pool in Point Richmond. The city had no money, and his rivals were complaining that we have no money to provide any services to the children and have no funds. And Tom Butt wants to throw $200,000 on a divider for a pool for rich kids, right? And that was a stinging rebuke, and there was some truth to it. Took that on. So now, what he's doing with the city manager and it's noise. You have to understand the structure of the government. The mayor doesn't have much power without 3 other council members. He has ceremonial power over the meeting, and he has tie-breaking power in that event. But for the most part, this is a legislature, right? And he's just one member of it, more prime minister than president. And so he's totally hamstrung because he has no allies on the council. So he can't dispense with the city manager without 4 votes. And there's pretty much no prospect of that happening. So my guess is, he knows that obviously. So why does he do that? Probably saber rattling, probably frustration. Is it calculated for some long-term benefit? Maybe. You're probably more astute observer on that than I am. But or was it just the lamentations of someone who was freaking out over not getting his way, which he tends to do, by the way. He can be impatient. And look at the context. He's in his late 70s. This is his last term. He's desperate to leave a legacy the way he does, and he's never been a coalition builder as a politician. He's always been a maverick, right? He's more John McCain than Barack Obama, or more John McCain than Joe Biden. And so that suits him well when he's a wing member of the council, but it suits him probably less well when he's on the center of the dais.
All right. Well,
I'll take one more.
One more.
Go ahead.
Oh, hi. I'm right now covering the Holocaust beat for the first class, and I was kind of really interested about the dumping issue you just mentioned, because last week I was driving past the San Pablo River and I got spot locations. There's a bunch of giant pieces, furniture,
Constantly.
dumping there, and the tire wells. And I also heard from a friend of mine, he is not from Bay Area, but he's from Philadelphia, and he also has some certain issues going around that during the moving season, a lot of people really can't find a spot to dump those giant furnitures. And I also check around the website, and I didn't saw some facilities that can take in those hazardous waste. They won't take giant, big furnitures. So, is the county has any plans for taking care of that kind of trash?
You're doing great, right? You're getting an idea of what's going on here. You're getting there. You hit the points. It costs a lot of money to dispose. People are highly incentivized to avoid the cost and instead impose it on the public right of way, which they do, which we wind up paying in a backdoor way when we ultimately have to go clean it up. At the same time, there's pressure on disposal units to dispose of waste in a more environmentally friendly way. One of the ways to deal with that pressure is to take less waste. Take waste that's less intensive and charge more for it. Who is it that disposes of the waste? It's not the county, it's not the city. We contract. We hire companies to do those jobs. Negotiating those contracts is a big deal. And I'm not in on those negotiations, but I would imagine that they have their team of lawyers making sure that they really are parsing what it is they're going to take and for how much and when they have to take it. And these are multi-million-dollar contracts, maybe tens of millions. And so we know, we get a handle first on what this process what it ultimately means, and you're almost there with that. Look at the results, and now you gotta reverse engineer and find out, how did we get here? How did this happen? And how can we make it better? And I don't have the answer to that. It's a complicated question. Supervisor Joya might know a little bit more about that than I do, actually, so maybe we can interview with him sometime. But you're getting in there, and I like the inquisitive mind you have looking at it. You see a big pile of trash, it's pretty easy to keep on walking. But if you really trace that, you might have a fascinating story. And it's an environmental story, and it's a health story, and it's a community story, and it's an economic story, and it's a conflict story. It's got it all. So, very interesting. I hope that was helpful. So, I'll wrap it up. I've taken too much of your time.
No, that's
Jeremy, I really appreciate being here. It's been a couple of years since I've been back.
Yeah.
But I always love coming back, and the place looks great. And I gotta tell you, I'm really envious of all you guys right now. Right? You're really, really in the catbird seat. This is a good spot. When I was sitting where you're sitting, in a class just like this, with an instructor just like this, but maybe yours a little better. A couple of years later, I had friends, I had valuable professional networks, I had a whole host of skills, and I had a whole new outlook. I grew tremendously in this role, first at Richmond Confidential, and then the rest of my classes for the other year and a half. So this is your time. This is your time in Richmond. This is your time at this school. This is your time to experiment and do your best and just do great journalism work and learn a lot while you're doing it. And act all the time in doing this. This is the beauty. You're not in a lab sequestered. Your work is out there in the public. You're a journalist, just like the others that are doing things. You're going to get your work in other publications as well. And it's going to have an impact on people. So remember to do the work like your work has an impact, like it matters. Because trust me, it does. So good luck.
I'm going to embarrass Robert when he mentioned that he was part of this new